Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I look at one of the most important sports card sets of all time, and a really good contender for the single most important card set of all time, which is 1988 Score Baseball. This card set laid the foundation for the entire 1990s. This was the card set that basically preceded the 90s. The 90s essentially started in 1989, but in 88, all the pieces that we needed to really make the decade what it was going to be happened. And that's what's so important about this card set, is the fact that it really did establish the whole checklist of what cards we're going to have. And the card industry would absolutely never be the same. Now, it wasn't immediate, but it was about as close as this era, as change in this era could possibly be. So first off, where did Score come from? And it had to come from the particular quirks of its origin in order to get to where it was. The card company started off as a company called Optographics. This was a card company that made, well, it was a company that made lenticular cards, and it did it for various companies. And so through the 1970s, they were doing specialty cards, and by 1986, they decided that they wanted to become a full-blown card company. They wanted to be manufacturing cards like Topps and Donruss and Fleer. Those were the only cards companies making cards. O-Pee-Chee was associated with Topps, and so that was basically the only other thing that you had in the industry. So for Optographics to launch into making cards, that was a really important step in the evolution of cards, simply because there was going to be a natural next step, and this was the first company to step up and really do this. And what they created was a card set called Sportflics. Now, Sportflics was lenticular, just like they'd been doing, but they'd been making these cards that were basically toys. Kellogg's lenticular cards are probably the best known of all these lenticular cards that were made during this time, and you can see really the bright, flashy quality that the cards had. And that was what Optographics had been doing, and then when they made Sportflics, they decided to step back and do something. It wasn't intriguing. It had a neat quality to it, but they weren't making cards really. They were making mementos for fans. That was really what they had done. And so starting in 1986 and really running all the way through 1990, they continued to make these cards, but they weren't able to compete because they didn't make something that could really inspire people. It couldn't build a really good, healthy audience to compete with Topps or Fleer or Donruss. So for 1988, they decided to go out and make an actual card brand. And the card brand that they made was called Score. Here, they stepped completely away from the whole lenticular world that was what they did. And instead, they made a card that was everything that a modern card would be. Everything that a modern card should be and would be. And of course, it starts off with the most important part about this card, which is the card stock itself. Now, cards are cardboard. That's what they are. But Topps took that quite literally, and it had a very thick, kind of a spongy cardboard material, and so it felt soft. Donruss and Fleer had better pressed and better bleached cardboard, but still they had a particular feel that felt natural for card collecting, but it didn't feel like something, it felt kind of flimsy. That was kind of the thing. So there needed to be something that had a really firm cardstock, something more akin to what we associate with, say, a business card. And that's what Score did. They have a very, very heavily pressed cardboard stock so that it's extremely thin. I mean, they actually came 17 cards in a pack. They were really thin, but they were very firm. Now, they did have the ability to kind of bend pretty easily. There was a delicate nature to them, but the big advantage that having this really thick cardstock had was you didn't have frayed corners. This card held up, and then failed all at once. So card collectors didn't really know how to feel about this. It took them a while to really get comfortable with it. But that was the thing. The thing was you needed to move away from these cheap made cards and get to something that's really professionally made, and that's what Score did. So the thin cardstock, the firm cardstock, that was critical. But on top of that, they did something else when they pressed it, which was they had a better surface on the card back to use for printing. Now, there was color that was already being printed on card backs, but here they were actually able to put a full color photo of the player and really put a lot of color in there. Now, that's really as much the printing technique as the surface itself. the printing that they did, they wanted to make a higher level of detail that they could go with. And if you look at the Topps or Fleer Donruss cards at this time, it's still kind of it's a rough print that's done more akin to magazines, just crank them out. Here they wanted to make something that was high quality, where when you look at it, all the fine little details are really strong. For 1988, their printing technique wasn't quite where it needed to be. They would grow that over the years and make it a lot better. But still, you look at this card and the amount of stuff on the card back was stunning. It was incredible. They packed tons of stuff on it. And it was a wide range of stuff too. So you had a color mugshot, never been done before. And then they had the whole bio stuffed up there. And then you had some of the history of the player's stats and some write-up about the player all packed in there. And it was all orderly, all neat, very nice. Not perfect, but very nice. And so it basically completely redefined what a card could be or how a card should be thought of. The card front itself is it's another innovation, because in this case they got away from design for the most part. Now, there had been some cards that had been done with very minimal design, but in this case what they did was they stripped away most of the card and they focused on having a border of color, just that. Almost nothing else. Yeah, there's a little triangle down at the bottom with a slight color fade for it, but other than that, it's all about that color as a thin band around the outside with a very rich image on the inside. That's the card. But the reason they could get away with this color was because they had a 660 card set and they broke that down into 110 card sections. So the first 110 cards, cards 1 through 110, those all have a raspberry border. And then from 111 to 220, they have a blue border. 221 to 330, red border. And then a green border, and then a yellow border, and they finish out with a light orange border. So that meant that this card set, as you go along through the card set, the colors, they keep changing. And so it keeps adding some interest to it, because a card set that's this big, that all looks the same, that's boring. But if you have a card set that's this big and it's one color and then a whole another color, the richness of that really comes through. And I can tell you from experience, building the set, as you're watching those colors build up, that pile gets bigger and you see all the colors, it's a really fun experience. And so that meant that this was candy for kids, in some ways quite literally, which meant that they were able to really effectively bring in a whole new audience. They had more cards per pack, and the cards were very, very stunning in terms of their look, and there was kind of an experience as you were building the set. So they were doing things that nobody else had done. It made the whole rest of the industry look lazy. But they didn't change the industry overnight, not at all. Topps wouldn't make much of a change at all for another half decade. Fleer, Donruss, they took their time moving away from the way that they'd been doing cards. It was incremental. Instead, what this card did was it defined a point, a benchmark, where from this day forward, anybody who comes in, this is how they have to do cards. NBA Hoops had more of a Fleer-like cardstock. It was still felt kind of like cardboard, but they were doing full color on the back. Everybody else was seriously making cards that were thin, firm, and rich in color, and that was the new industry. And like I said, it would take a while for the big three to finally catch up and get with the program, because they were cranking out tons of cards dirt cheap and they were selling. But that can only last so long until you get crowded out in the market. So what this card set did was it gave a template for everybody moving forward. And then while Score didn't really do great card design itself, it provided all of the template for companies like Pro Set to go in and make card sets that could change the industry overnight. And that was really what you saw as the 90s progressed, was everybody was tripping over each other, innovating, moving forward. This was the set that provided what you needed. It's interesting to look at now because it doesn't look all that interesting. It's a really boring card design, just the way that they did it. They didn't put much into it, but at the time, this was actually stunningly innovative. This truly was cutting edge in every way. It just didn't feel right. And in fact, even beyond that, it wasn't just the cards themselves that were really innovative. What about the wrapper? Now, up until this point, everybody except Sportflix had been using wax wrappers. A wax wrapper is a sheet of wax paper. It's folded around the card, and then you can press it and it seals up. Sort of seals up. The problem is you can take that, open it up, pull the cards out. As long as you don't pull it open too much, pull the cards out, pull out the good cards you want, put other cards in, put it back in, and you can reseal it yourself. That was a big, big, big problem. Now in a card shop, as long as the card shop's reputable, you know that the card shop owner is not going to do that, because it's in his best interest or her best interest to make sure that the product is reliable, because they want to sell products. They're not interested in pulling out all the good cards, because if they can no longer sell packs, if they're no longer trusted, they're not going to make much money. But a lot of these packs were sold in grocery stores, sold in Kmart's, and so that meant that they were just sitting there waiting to be picked through. And wax packs, that was a big problem. Score, just like with Sportflics, they had a Polywrap wrapper. And that Polywrap wrapper is a wrapper that's designed to fail. It's plastic and it is sealed, absolutely sealed, so that the two pieces of plastic become one. You can't pull them apart. When you pull it open, it just tears. So the wrappers themselves were designed to fail so that you could guarantee if that wrapper's intact, nobody's been in there. And that was a quality control issue that was addressed by Score, that again, everybody who came into the hobby made sure that they followed exactly that. And so that was another industry changer that was critical for the development of Score and for the ability for Score to really push forward. But it wasn't just innovation that they did either. They also, for their first year, they did box bottoms. So this was a common thing that Topps and Fleer and I don't think Donruss was doing it, but I know that Fleer did do it for 1 or 2 years. You have a card box, and on the bottom you actually have printed on there 4 cards. Now this makes perfect sense because you're a printing company, you're printing the box, why wouldn't you do that? Unlike what you would see with Upper Deck, in the inside of these boxes, they also have the backs to the cards. So you could literally get one of these boxes. You either buy the complete box and open up all the packs, or you, as a kid, you talk to the card shop manager and just ask them if you can have one of the boxes when they're done. Take it home, cut the cards out, and you have an additional set of cards. There were 24 that they had, but they came in those panels of 4. So that was another thing that Score did, but only in that first year. So it was kind of piggybacking some of the things that were done, but for the most part, they were doing cutting edge stuff. And on top of all that, they also included in their packs a little something in every pack. This was something everybody did. Everybody had that thing that was common to them. Topps, of course, is famous for always having gum in their packs, all the way through 1990. Well, for Fleer, they had stickers. Donruss, they had puzzle pieces. For Sportflics, they had a miniature Sportflics. It was a trivia, or it was a highlights type of a card, basically talking about some event. Well, for Score, they continued to do that. So even though Sportflics had lenticular cards with miniature lenticular cards, here in Score, they had regular cards, but they still had a lenticular card. Then in the case of 1988, they had a baseball fact, an interesting game that had happened, or an event at a game. And so it was this 56 card set of these little, again, these weren't trivia, these were talking about the history of the game. And for 56 examples of the history of the game, this was a great thing for kids. So you open up the pack, you're getting your 17 cards, and you get this special card that helps to kind of give you some insight into the history of baseball. So it was a multifaceted affair, and it was a lot of fun. And you could buy, if you bought a complete set of Score, it came with a complete set of these cards as well. So it was a neat thing. The way that they approached it, they really were well designed for kids, but they were also designed for adult collectors as well. And Topps was doing their traded set, Fleer was doing update, Donruss had its extra set. There was another set to look at rookies and traded cards that everybody was doing. Score did the same thing. So it did an additional 110 cards with a dark orange border that was their supplemental, or in this case, it was cards number 1 through 110, but there was a T at the end of it. So they also had that as well, and that was sold as a complete set. But that wasn't the only thing that they sold, because they also sold a special set of glossy cards. Topps at this point was doing Tiffany cards every single year, and Fleer was doing their glossy cards, so Score did a set of glossy cards. And what this was a whole set that was printed on a higher level quality of cardstock and done with a glossy surface. So it was a higher end version of the set, and they were sold in complete set form. So Score had the whole thing from 1 to 660 plus the 1T through 110T. all in glossy. And so you can tell the difference between them pretty clearly. But the set itself was done, it was interesting in the fact that you didn't have just 660 cards stuck in there. You had all the different colors, but they also had some of the traditions that other brands were using. So for instance, they had a 5-card set looking at the career of Reggie Jackson. And so you get to see every stop that he had, every team that he played for. And then later on in the set, they have their rookie prospects. So they were doing that, which was a common thing. They had cards of pairings of players. And they also had a set of cards looking at the highlights of 1987. So instead of a recap of the year, it's just looking at certain events that happened in the year that were really notable. So that was the way that they designed the set. And they really didn't do hardly anything else. In fact, the only other thing they did was their first Young Superstars set. This was something they would do year after year. And this was a 40-card set. It was sold in complete set form in the same glossy card stock as their Score glossy set. Here it looks more like one of the Kmart or one of the Toys R Us cards. It looks, it doesn't look very professionally made, but it was never intended to be that way. This is the kind of thing that you would get in like a blister pack. And you just buy it off the shelf. But they did make 2 sets. So these are all Young Superstars coming up. And the first set is, they're both white bordered, but the first one has a blue border with green detailing. And then the second set, they have a blue border with pink detailing. Otherwise, the cards are the same. The numbers are repeated too. They're both 1 through 40. And that was how they started out their time. But the set itself was just, it was so landmark. It was so right out there at the front. And it really did shake up the industry. I would argue way, way, way more than Upper Deck would in the next year. It would really be Pro Set, though, that would define the 90s coming forward. So Pro Set basically took everything that Score did and just did it a whole lot better. I mean, the first year for Pro Set and Score, they were pretty parallel in their run, but starting in 1990, Pro Set just took off, and so did the whole industry. So it's fun to look at the set and see essentially where the 90s came from. And if you ever really want to get a feel for just how stark this was, get a Topps card from 1988, get either a Donruss or Fleer, doesn't matter, getting both is great, and get a Score. Look at the 3 cards or 4 cards. Look at just how different that Score card is. Because understand that the Topps card is the same they'd been doing for decades. The Fleer, same as they'd been doing since they started. Donruss, same as they'd been doing since they'd started. So that was the way cards were. Then you look at that Score and you realize just how different it is, just how starkly different it is. So I'm going to be looking at the other Score sets coming up, so definitely check those out. Subscribe if you haven't done so already. Check out the other videos, and yeah, thank you very much for watching.